Empire is emerging today as a center that supports the globalization of productive networks, and it casts its widely inclusive net to try to envelop all power relations within its world order. And yet, at the same time, it deploys a powerful police function against the new barbarians and the rebellious slaves who threaten its order. Michael Hart and Antonio Negri stated. But what is the genesis of American imperialism? To what extent has the United States continued the British Empire's ideological process, and what's the role of American exceptionalism in all this? What are the racial implications of territorial expansion, colonialism, post-colonialism, decolonialism, imperialism, globalization? Are these categories the morphing masks of empire? In this episode, we will elaborate on all these matters. Today, on Personae, Andy Doolen. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Good. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. We'll be talking about colonialism, post-colonialism, and also about empire, pretty much. But let us begin to talking about you and the social context you grew up in America. You were born in 1968. Mm-hmm. How was it like? What are your memories about America back in the 70s and in the 80s?
Well, I grew up in the Chicago metropolitan area. And pretty strictly middle-class upbringing. My dad was a high school teacher, I think my memories, of course, were as a kid were how just a lot of family, a lot of sports, a lot of friends. I grew up in the sort of the Catholic school system, I had sort of very serious and strict teachers. I was not always a great student. And I think once I graduated high school and went to college, I think is where I started to develop, I think, some ideas about American culture. I started to get more involved with issues sort of beyond my immediate community. And of course, those were the Reagan years, right? So I went to college in 1987, the United States was involved in a lot of the political struggles happening in Central America. And I can remember distinctly, I think, as a sophomore in college when I went to the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire in Wisconsin. And so the Spanish department had brought in some speakers to talk about the conflicts in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And I think I distinctly remember walking out of that day of talks and meetings, just sort of having my world turned upside down. They had provided perspectives that I wasn't seeing in the newspaper, and they weren't on the news. They weren't topics of conversation with my friends.
Mm-hmm. For example, can you tell us a couple of topics that weren't covered in the media?
Well, for example, if you were, I think, the typical college student in those days, these were the days before, 100+ cable channels. You might have listened to the news once in a while, but generally, you read the Chicago Tribune or the Minneapolis Star Tribune. The dominant view was that the United States was aiding in some of the political struggles in Central America, aiding some of the factions that were for freedom, the freedom fighters perhaps in Nicaragua, and so it was a very slanted discourse that was very hard to get a handle on on your own. And I think where I went to school, there were some very committed teachers who were trying to bring alternative viewpoints to the students, and this was not an event that I was required to go to, but I just sort of found myself there. You know, it was something that led me into Spanish classes. You know, I remember one particular class just called Central American Revolutions. And it actually, this was, you know, 1988, 1989. And there was very little in the class actually about what was happening in El Salvador and Nicaragua in 1988 or 1989. A lot of it was about the history of Central American revolutions. And I think it was a very clever move by the professor. That he, you know, everyone sort of was immersed in the history itself. So you know, you're studying Guatemala in 1956, you're studying the Cuban Revolution, and you just sort of naturally start to get a counter perspective on U.S. activity in the Western Hemisphere. So you know, I was in English and a history minor, and so it was a very different perspective on U.S. involvement in foreign affairs than I was receiving in my history classes. You know, my first Spanish teacher was a very memorable guy who fought in the Cuban Revolution, eventually fled Cuba, and it was Spanish 101, and it was a class full of juniors and seniors, and none of us wanted to pay attention to the grammar. We all did, and we basically, our whole goal for the day was trying to get him to tell stories about what it was like in Cuba, and he would set aside his syllabus and he would just sort of talk to us, and you know, we thought it was a digression. We thought we were clever in getting him off the syllabus, but actually he had sort of instilled sort of a lifelong love of the Spanish language and Latin American history that came out of a Spanish 101 class. And so I think those experiences were sort of ad hoc in nature. There was nothing planned about it. That was sort of in the air in the late 80s. I think for students who were looking for sort of a political perspective that was outside of the mainstream, it wasn't as easy to get it in those days. You know, without the internet, these things weren't a click away. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, and by the time I left college, 1991, you know, that was the first U.S.-Iraq war. And so, you know, these years of thinking about U.S. involvement in Latin America, I think prepared me to take a more critical view of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 1991.
Mm-hmm. So you've always had this double view, or you've been informed by these two political perspectives of what was going on in Latin America and the States, and that helped you understand much better American culture as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think if U.S. involvement in Central America in the 1980s is a primer course, then when you're leaving college, when the U.S. is going to war in Iraq, becomes sort of the logical extension of that imperial activity. That, you know, the U.S. involvement in the Western Hemisphere, which has been ongoing, you know, since you know, the 1790s. Obviously, now in retrospect, in 2015, the movement of the U.S. military into the Middle East in 1991 is the extension of those 19th century and late 18th century activities. So yeah, I think you know, looking back on it, I guess I've never thought about it before, but that connection between learning about the U.S. Central American relationship and how and seeing in the real world how that ideology and that politics can extend U.S. power into the Middle East was quite eye-opening, I think, for a young person.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that we've changed in the media, how we portray and how we talk about different topics? Or do you feel like we are pretty much repeating the same stories one and over again? Like now we have the internet, but on TV, there's no so much of alternative views.
That's a good question. On one hand, I think this ideology of American exceptionalism that posits, you know, the U.S. military into the Middle East in 1991 is the extension of those 19th century and late 18th century activities. So yeah, I think the introduction of U.S.-style political values, social customs, is a positive thing and leads to progress, is something that was articulated at the founding of the United States. And in these moments of crisis, the proponents of an ideology of American exceptionalism are even more enthusiastic and with their defense of it. And so I think on the one hand, things are worse because more of a defense is required. And on the other, I think there's probably more resistance to the extension of U.S. power across the globe than there ever has been.
Mm-hmm. So would you equate, that's one of the things that this book that I have here, Hart and Negri, his book Empire, seem to equate, they seem to equate globalization with American imperialism. Do you agree with that, or to what extent is that accurate?
You know, Chalmers Johnson is somebody who writes about U.S. empire, and I sort of appreciate his less abstract way of understanding how to map the spread of U.S. empire. And he looks at essentially the number of military bases that dot the globe and the expansion of these military bases. And you might add to those military bases U.S. embassies and consulates. So if you look at all these sites, the military bases, whether you're in Germany or whether you're in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the consulates, the embassies, these are all spaces of U.S. power. They're protected by laws, they're protected by military force. And these sort of satellites of the U.S. nation state, I think, have expanded over time. Now, whether that's part of a larger process of globalization or not, I think is a very complicated question. But for me, because I tend to, you know, both of my books are about, you know, the 18th and 19th century. I tend to I think historically. I situate contemporary questions historically, and you know, the argument that Chalmers Johnson lays out in his studies of the expansion of the American empire, you know, is preceded by the history of territorial expansion in North America, the placement of you know, what are called trading factories, or what in, you know, common parlance is our forts. And these trading factories were designed to be a sort of a fusion of commercial and military power. The military aspect was that was designed to protect U.S. settlers, and the commercial aspect was to not only to enrich those settlers, but also to draw native nations into the U.S. orbit. And Thomas Jefferson himself theorized that the best way to control you know, these hundreds of native nations who posed a serious threat to the expansion of the United States across North America, the best way to do that was to drive the native nations into debt. Right? So if you could connect these native nations who were a threat to the United States specifically because they were independent and they were powerful and they could ally with each other. Well, if you could manage to you know, create a relationship with the Osage or the Cherokee, and create a relationship where they would ultimately be in debt to you, then you controlled them in some respect. And I think, for me, the lessons of globalization are sort of imprinted in that early history. They're sort of, you know, it's a double-sided coin. The globalization entails, in some sense, the spread of commerce, but it also entails, as Chalmers Johnson and others would say, the spread of military force.
Mm-hmm. And in your book, you mentioned early imperialism. In your book, The Fugitive Empire, located in early American imperialism, you seem to rethink what the origin of the American empire is actually built upon. You trace it back to 1741 and the New York conspiracy trial. In historiography, we tend to think that it is after 1898 or around that date. Mm-hmm. So what can you tell us about that date and the New York conspiracy trial?
Well, in a way, the date's just totally arbitrary. So I chose all histories are arbitrary with their beginning and ending points. Mm-hmm. And the slave conspiracy of 1741 in New York City, for me, was a paradigmatic and a symbolic moment for marking an early stage of what would become U.S. Empire. And so, what I do basically in that book and then in my other book is I try to move back the timeline of U.S. empire. So as you noted, typically when scholars talk about U.S. empire or American imperialism, they often tag it to the year 1898 when the United States engaged in a series of sort of we could consider ordinary acts of empire. They were far-flung military exercises against the Philippines, and other places. And so this is something that is considered to be sort of a textbook definition of a nation state expanding across space, basically expanding across the ocean. Now, in recent years, scholars like Shelley Strebe have defined the U.S.-Mexico War as sort of an alternative starting point. And so these days in my field, the U.S.-Mexico War has become that precursor to 1898. So you have 1846 now standing as sort of a place where people say, wait a second, we can actually trace these articulations of imperial power back even earlier. And what Strebe does and what other scholars do with the U.S.-Mexico War is they describe territorial conquest as the sort of earlier expression. And so what my goal then was to keep sort of examining this genealogy and trying to find an even earlier starting point. And so basically that's what I've spent my career doing is exploring sort of American culture and exploring the nature of American power in this larger context, and to sort of think that 1846 those that ideological setting just didn't emerge overnight, that it existed in the 1780s, the 1790s, and so I think what you see in 1741 is you see how New York City, which is even at that early date, is a global city. Its ports are tied to ports all over the world. A multinational mix of people are living in New York, and the slave population that's in New York that is accused of conspiring against white power represents something that happens repeatedly over the 18th and 19th centuries, and that is a form of popular resistance in the form of a slave conspiracy against governing authority. And now the interesting thing to me was that there was never any legitimate proof that this conspiracy actually existed. And of course, this is the great lesson of all slave revolts. They're real and imagined. They're imagined by whites because they fear the threat that this body of defiant slaves poses to their power and to their personal safety. And the fear often leads to some wild speculations about what that population is up to. And so even to this day, we're not quite sure what was happening in 1741, and the existing historical records are written by slaveholders themselves, so they're not very reliable, because oftentimes that fear and anxiety, the need to rationalize the violence that was done against those slaves sort of comes out in the trial manuscripts. A lot of that evidence is tainted by the interrogation of slaves. It's tainted by false confessions. And so for me, that moment in 1741 was symbolic of the way that U.S. historiography has evolved. And it evolves with those uncertainties and those fears and those sort of unthinkable revolutions that are sort of embedded in the way we tell the story about an exceptional United States. So that's what 1741, I think, that's the sort of that purpose that it served in my book.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the existence of what you call it, the historical trinity of U.S. imperialism. You say that it's based on war, slavery, and territorial expansion,
right, as
a system of racial domination.
Right. Well, I think the key there, the historical trinity, as I envisioned it at the time, it tells us something very important, I think, about the early United States, and that is our belief in American exceptionalism is rooted in an anti-imperial war of independence. And so the American Revolution is typically depicted as an anti-imperial struggle. And so for generations, the conventional wisdom is that it's nonsensical to claim that this new nation state is an empire when it was precisely driven by an anti-imperial revolution. There are kernels of truth in that argument, but it's not an either-or proposition. So the nation state that's created out of that anti-imperial struggle also had at its foundation a system of racial power, and that connected it to its colonial beginnings. So an ideology of American exceptionalism assumes a very clear break between the birth of an independent America and the sort of leaving behind of the colonial world. And when you focus on the system of racial oppression, or just say the rhetoric of racial demonization that you see that gets infiltrated in all sorts of American cultural materials, from poetry to novels to laws to autobiographies, newspapers, the whole gamut of what's called cultural production. You see that while the American nation state was very different than the British colonies, an independent nation state versus a collection of colonies, the one thing that unified those entities was race. Was not only an emerging sense of whiteness, but also was the economic system of chattel slavery and the process of territorialization that drove Native Americans off the land. And so that's the common thing. That's the linkage. And so that was the argument that I made in Fugitive Empire, was that before one makes pronouncements about the birth of an independent United States, one has to somehow come to grips with the dependency of the new United States on these very colonial forms of power that sort of these days fall under the term settler colonialism. So in my field, a lot of people are starting to use that terminology, that the United States is no different than other settler colonial states, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, and others. And that's the sort of argument that I was making.
So Andy, how did local events like the conspiracy trial play a primary role in forging American imperialism?
Well, I think that's the part that fascinates me the most about U.S. history, is how some very small moments that have either been neglected by scholars or totally forgotten, certainly nothing that I ever learned about in high school or college, and actually play a primary role in forging the power of an expansionist nation state. And so you can take these episodes like the New York slave conspiracy, or you can take one of any number of treaty negotiations with native nations, on the western border. That each one of these isolated moments contributed to the extension of the United States, and they always took place in negotiation or in sort of a very anxious awareness of British power on the border, French power on the border, Spanish power on the border, that in the same way that native nations were establishing alliances with these European empires in North America, the United States was doing the exact same thing. And it often took place in these settings that we can no longer reconstruct, that we no longer remember, that we barely even have the historical evidence to understand. And I think in that sense, I think it challenges us to get outside of a nation-centered understanding of national consciousness, of American history. And it always, I think, places an imperative on understanding the cross-currents that take place over borders. And so, for example, if you look in New York at the time, not only was the slave population multinational in a sense that some of those slaves came from the West Indies, some came directly from Africa, some came from the southern United States, but also the inhabitants of New York came from all over the globe. And so I think that global aspect, that global context for understanding the development of the United States challenges sort of a naive understanding that I think we tend to want to have when viewing the American past, and that when we sort of look at North America as an experiment, that it was distant from Europe, and I think when you look at it from a sort of a transnational perspective, you see that the United States was never independent. It was always dependent on other native nations, on other European nations. It was constantly in negotiation with these other entities.
Mm-hmm. Where would you place the line between colonialism and post-colonialism? I say this because so many Latin American critics like Walter Mignolo, Quijano, Dussel do not agree with the post-colonial theory in the sense that they deny that we live in a post-colonial world, and it's actually a stage of continuous colonialization somehow. So what would you place that line between colonialism and post-colonialism in U.S. history?
Well, a settler nation like the 1820s United States, the United States in 1840, is always colonizing and colonized at the same time. That's how scholars sort of understand this sense of a settler nation always being involved in a process of trying to establish ownership of the land, trying to define an identity against a former self. And I think, while I don't tend to talk about the United States as a post-colonial nation, it can certainly be, technically looked at as a post-colonial nation. But I think some native scholars I think, make an excellent point about how to understand the post and post-colonial. Because from a native perspective, it doesn't make sense to talk about a post-colonial United States when the United States continues to try to assert its colonizing relationship to native nations. They try to maintain U.S. jurisdiction over native bodies, native land, native resources. And so native scholars, so in other words, this idea of the post and post-colonial is something that greatly interests native scholars. And so what I've learned from them is this notion that post can mean above and beyond, right? And so one can be both things at the same time. And I think that's what you see, particularly with the early United States, it may have been a post-colonial nation state in the sense that it broke free from an empire, but at the same time, it was a colonizing nation state. And so, so I think it's, for me, it's important to keep that that tension always at the forefront of my study.
So, what does post-colonial theory do?
When we're talking about counter-hegemonic articulations, we're talking about ways in which, let's just say, writers at a particular time, thinkers at a particular time, develop alternative ways of speaking about themselves, speaking about their communities, alternative ways of resisting power. And I think, those articulations, can be developed through a thoughtful engagement with post-colonial theory. Because what post-colonial theory does is sort of, I think it teaches readers about the way that power creates itself. It teaches readers how to identify and take apart an ideological apparatus like Said does in Orientalism. And so in that sense, these are sort of tools for, post-colonial theory is a tool for survival. It's a tool for developing, I think, alternative ways of thinking about, just in my context, national historiography. Alternative ways of thinking about American political values, American nationhood. It's hard for me to fathom how much of that work would be possible without the contributions of post-colonial theory or theorists.
Mm-hmm. And what would you make if the decolonial theory that writers like Quijano, Mignolo, Dussel, mm-hmm. and are talking about nowadays?
Well, I don't know. I think, just take for example, we don't even have to talk about, say, Spivak or Fanon. Take, two figures who people might not look at as hardcore theorists, W.E.B. Du Bois and Ralph Ellison. So, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the most, prominent, African-American scholars in the 20th century, developed this idea of double consciousness. And I think that concept has stood at the foundation of a lot of, say, anti-racist work that emerged in the 20th and 21st century, where scholars were inspired by Du Bois's perspective on the way that race operates in American culture. In a way, he's saying things that a lot of post-colonial critics basically build upon, whether they acknowledge it or not. And again, a novelist like Ellison talking about the metaphor of invisibility to talk about race in America. These are things that obviously were driving the decolonization movements after World War II. And in those ways, I think they can be quite radical in their application. And so, I think I'm probably more, as someone who is, I guess I'm more of an historicist than a theoretician. And so maybe that's why I'm more optimistic than, say, somebody like Spivak, because I think for my purposes, I'm constantly searching for ways to intervene in mainstream historical narratives and find ways to redefine it, and try to find ways to make neglected topics, to make literature, to make culture an important sphere for redefining our sense of collective identity. So,
I have a quote here from Anya Lumba's Colonialism, Post-Colonialism, a book that you recommended me in the past and for which I'm really grateful. Let me read. In recent post-colonial theory and criticism, some critics allege literary texts begin to stand in for social processes, for all social processes. Analysis of representation and discourse replaces all discussion of events and material reality. It has been suggested that this tendency emanates from Orientalism, which situates literary texts as a colonial battlefield. So, to what extent would you agree with Anya Lumba's statement?
Well, I think from my perspective, culture has always been the battlefield for these questions.
To have competing narratives at the same time, to legitimize, or
absolutely. I mean, you just take a couple of take the two famous examples from the 19th century, the slave narrative and what's called Native American autobiography. Both forms couldn't be more radical. In both forms, you have individuals who are assumed to be less sophisticated, less literate than their Anglo contemporaries, where there's a host of racist assumptions about how they think, about how they write, if they can write, all these things. That when these books emerged in the public sphere, they were attacked vociferously from all sectors of U.S. society. The leading figures in the U.S. government who were in charge of what was called, Indian policy, attacked Native American autobiographies precisely because here you have this rare example in U.S. culture at the time where a Native American figure was providing a perspective on Native life, Native ideas, Native customs that oftentimes ran counter to what Anglo experts argued. So they were essentially defying the authority of those experts. Same thing for the slave narrative, right? So slave narratives were essential to the anti-slavery movement because, in a very basic way, they proved that that African Americans, of course, were equal in every capacity to Anglos, and at the same time, they provided a sort of documentary account of what was happening on Southern plantations. And as Frederick Douglass sort of notes in a very famous episode, when Northerners would come to Southern plantations and observe slave singing, they would come away thinking that slaves were happy and cheerful. Yeah. And in Douglass's autobiography, he not only includes the example of slave singing, but then he provides a counter argument, and which essentially stands in for a larger discourse where where whites in the North cannot understand what's happening in the South. So it's a propaganda battle. And so so culture was always a site of struggle. And I think looking at it, say, for any student today, looking at it from 2015, if you take an historical perspective, it means that a lot of the things that you're going to be uncovering and trying to understand that come out of the 1810s, 1830s, 1850s, 1870s are going to be books that were either consciously suppressed, books that were neglected because they simply did not conform to the conventional wisdom of the time. And so any sort of work in culture from those periods is recovery work. You're constantly locating documents that were dismissed, that were argued against, that were diminished in value, and the role of the scholar is trying to find ways to reconstruct those histories, to invest them with some alternative value.
Mm-hmm. And who empowers culturally one discourse or another?
I think for literary historians, there has been an awareness of the way power constructs the literary canon I think for at least since the 1960s. And so the way that, so in other words, the fact that that our students go to college and take an American literature class and read women, they read African Americans, they read Asian Americans, they read a wide range of writers from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. That was in large part, say in my experience, was where I learned that lesson was from feminist teachers, from reading feminist criticism, for thinking about the ways where, 40 years ago, 19th century U.S. literary history looked very different than it looks today. There are so many women writers who were forgotten, but now scholars have gone back into the archives, recovered those novels, reinterpreted them, explained why they may have been very popular in 1851, but then were promptly sort of faded into obscurity. So in that sense, coming out, I think, out of our multicultural 1980s, is that, yeah, I think we have a pretty good sense that the canon, that white, that basically sort of the, a white racial identity defined the parameters of the canon for quite a long time. So I think literary historians, understand that, and they recognize that. And Foucault, of course, was very influential for a lot of scholars doing this sort of recovery work. And then on the other hand, there's, I think, in history, the power can be sometimes more obscure. It can be harder to see, and so for example, for Foucault, power resides at the source of historical production. So when historical narratives are assembled, when facts are identified as facts, when there's a priority of facts that are laid out, when the narrative is created, that this sort of production of an historical narrative is riven through with power. And so, the Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, who wrote a book called Silencing the Past, it's a brilliant book because he's talking about how historical narratives that are shaped by power are oftentimes blind to the very moments that are that the historian is trying to understand. So, for example, Trouillot writes about the Haitian Revolution, right? That started in 1793 and ended in 1804, and he talks about how at the time and then subsequently in the 19th century, observers didn't use the word revolution, right? Because the assumption was that a slave colony could be in revolt, which suggests a sort of an irrational outpouring of violence, but it could not be in revolution because European and U.S. observers could not conceive of the possibility that slaves had the capacity to organize a revolution on the scale, or that was in the same vein as the French and American revolutions. And so he calls the Haitian Revolution sort of an unthinkable event. So for historians, we can sort of identify how that sense, that power that exists at the root of that historical narrative is displayed in our total inability to see it as a revolution.
Your second book, Territories of Empire, U.S. Writing from the Luciana Purchase to Mexican Independence. What can the reader find in it?
I think of it as sort of a second installment of my study of U.S. empire. The word territories refers to what I think I didn't quite, I wasn't really ready to understand, I think, in my first book, and that is the importance of territory in the making of the U.S. empire. And also it sort of signals the transnational emphasis of the book, U.S. writing from the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 to the Mexican War of Independence. And for me, in a small way, I thought it would give people pause to see something that's sort of quintessentially American, the Louisiana Purchase. It's looked at as one of the sort of founding nation-building events in the 19th century, when the U.S. purchased a massive swath of land from France. So you put that next to something that is decidedly very, I guess, non-patriotic, the Mexican War of Independence. And so I spend the book figuring out how the extension of the United States across space inevitably brought the United States into contact not only with defiant native nations, but also with the Spanish Empire and then an independent Mexico. And so a lot of the material that I'm studying in that book is not published or written in the Atlantic states, but in the Western borderlands. So for most 19th century Americanists like myself, when you talk to them about literary history is essentially a history of the Northeast. It's a history of New York, Boston, Philadelphia. And so if you talk about the canon and sort of how canons expand and why there's they're always going to be argued about, is because in the United States at this time, there was all sorts of cultural production taking place in Cincinnati, in St. Louis, in New Orleans, in different sections of the United States. And this body of literature speaks to other issues of nationhood, other issues of culture, other issues of social struggle than you see in the writings of Northeasterners. And for me, this was sort of an overlooked chapter of our past. For me, it certainly was not something, you don't see courses in graduate school on these sorts of writings. It's not something that I think a lot of people are prepared to understand. Oftentimes, the writing that I'm studying in this book is classified as regional writing, mm-hmm. or Western writing, and I don't look at it that way. I look at it, a lot of these texts are circulating not only in the United States but through Latin America, and I think it's not a transatlantic way of looking at the development of the United States, but it's a distinctly transnational one. Mm-hmm. It's not hemispheric, mm-hmm. right? So in other words, and a lot of people in my field, they take a hemispheric approach where they widen their scope, and instead of focusing just on the nation state or those national boundaries, they look at the United States in a hemispheric context. And while I'm partial to that sort of thinking, my historicist emphasis traces sort of the transnational linkages between the United States and Mexico. So the very pathways of expansion that were defining territorialization in the 19th century United States and took the United States, took its power into modern-day Mexico is exactly the sort of transnational map that I've created for myself in that book. It blurs the lines between what's a literary document and what's a political document. Because at this time, for example, one of the first novels written that's based in the American Southwest and in Mexico was Timothy Flint's Francis Berrien, or The Memoirs of a Mexican Patriot. It's a popular novel about an Anglo freedom fighter who leaves the United States to help fight for Mexican independence. In this very fat book, a piece of imagination, you learn more about the Mexican War of Independence than you will in virtually any other document published in the United States at the period. So for a literary scholar, it's pretty fascinating because you're faced with this reality that perhaps the American novel is your only guide to understanding what Americans were learning about the war in Mexico at the time.
Mm-hmm. And how it's being incorporated in some other identities into the national.
Right, and how sort of an ideology of American exceptionalism, even then, was informing how U.S. citizens saw the war in Mexico. So here you have this war in Mexico, an anti-imperial struggle, right? It's the Mexican nation against Spain, and so Americans saw this as they felt a certain kinship with Mexicans at the time. They felt as if their ideals and their political ideology was being sort of magically exported into Mexico. That's the ideology of American exceptionalism, the sense that you get from the Northerners in the United States that the political events in Mexico were due to Anglo-American ideals, Anglo-American institutions, like Republican institutions. That these were the factors that were shaping the momentous events in Mexico, and not, say, what you get in Mexican historiography, and that is, of course, their own ideas about what made a nation state, their own regional conflicts between, say, Oaxaca and the North, and a whole range of other factors, like how their political system is going to come out of the Spanish constitutions and things like that. And so the novel basically sort of models the exact way that U.S. historians will tell the same story about the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico at that time.
So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to close our discussion today with just a brief reflection on something I wrote in my last book, Territories of Empire. It comes out of this study of the effects of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, when the U.S. more than doubled in physical size. The purchase also inspired a dream, and that dream was of a bounded and coherent territorial space, and of an impassable physical partition between friend and enemy, between domestic and foreign. And this dream is endemic in empires and settler nations across history. And so I bring this up because we're in the middle of an election season, and Donald Trump is in the news. And I often ask my students to take these sorts of figures seriously, because here we are in this rising tide of xenophobia, where Donald Trump is talking about building a massive, huge wall across the U.S.-Mexico border. And while he's very easy to ridicule and to make fun of, I think that these figures actually give us much to criticize and much to think about, and how American empire is being conceived today. And so here's just a small passage that reflects on that image that Trump creates of the U.S.-Mexico border. So, while designed to represent the dominance of the state, the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border is, as Wendy Brown writes, a visual paradox. Even as the wall stages a spectacular technology of separation and domination, it cannot deter transnational passages. This dream has a genealogy that can be traced back to the Louisiana Purchase and its aftermath, when the unimaginable scale of the new national territory and the sudden awareness that the state could never monopolize the organization of it began to be forged into the core of U.S. imperial power. So that's how I end the book, and I see sort of statements by the likes of Trump and sort of this sort of anti-immigrant politics that we have in the United States today as giving voice to that visual paradox of essentially asserting a desire to have a spectacular technology that separates us from them. And I think what happens when you study U.S. history is that that's a dream that cannot be realized in reality. That transnational passages, the crossing of borders, is something that is constant over time. So thanks.